Hey there! Welcome to Lurkbound. I'm so glad you're here. There's something about the quiet parts of the world, the places people don't usually look, that holds the most chilling secrets. Tonight, I've put together a collection of true accounts that prove sometimes the things we fear aren't just in our heads. They're out there, waiting in the silence. I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel, so definitely let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you're a fan of these kinds of stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to support what I do here. Now, make sure your doors are locked, settle in, and let's see what's lurking in the dark. I used to sleep in my grandfather's old room after he passed away. From the start, something about that room never felt normal, but I was young and didn't really question it. Every single night, right around 8 p.m., I would hear a sharp noise, like something heavy being dropped on the floor. It wasn't random. It was the same sound, the same volume, at the exact same time. I told my parents over and over, and they insisted it was just the house settling. I wanted to believe them because I didn't want to feel scared in my own room. At first, their explanation comforted me, but after a while I noticed the pattern was too perfect. Houses don't settle on a schedule. One night I decided I would catch it in the act. I stood near the spot where I thought the noise was coming from and just waited. I remember staring at the wall and listening so hard my ears almost hurt. 8 o'clock came and went. Nothing. I waited another 30 minutes. Still nothing. After nearly an hour I felt stupid and tired, so I climbed back into bed. The moment I lay down, my bed started shaking violently. Not a little tremble. Not something I could brush off. The entire frame rattled like someone had grabbed it and was shaking it with both hands. My heart shot into my throat. For a second I thought I was imagining it. That panic was making everything feel bigger than it was. I jumped out of bed and turned the light on. The bed was still shaking. I could see it. The mattress was vibrating, the frame knocking against the floor in fast, uneven bursts. My first thought was my dog had crawled underneath and was stuck, thrashing around. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. There was nothing there. No dog, no object, no explanation. Just empty space and my bed continuing to shake like it had a mind of its own. After what felt like forever, it stopped as suddenly as it started. The silence afterward felt thick and wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, my TV broke. The screen turned a solid, sickly green and refused to respond to anything. The remote never worked again. The only way to turn it on was by pressing the physical power button on the set. It felt like a stupid coincidence at first, just bad timing layered on top of a rough night. But then something happened that made my stomach drop. I was sitting at my desk doing homework, bored out of my mind. I remember thinking, clear as day, I wish I could just relax and watch something. Right as the thought finished, as the TV clicked on by itself. The screen flashed, and it switched directly to the channel I always watched. No static, no delay. Just on. I didn't touch it. The remote was across the room and didn't even work anymore. I stared at it for maybe 2 seconds before pure fear took over. I bolted out of my room and didn't go back in for hours. My chest felt tight, like the air had been sucked out of the hallway behind me. It wasn't just that the TV turned on. It felt like something had answered me. After that, I started noticing markings on the ceiling. They hadn't been there before. I would have seen them. The ceiling was bright white, but there were patches of a slightly different white, like someone had painted over something and done a sloppy job. The shapes weren't random streaks. They had edges, curves, lines that looked intentional. I asked my mum about them and she shrugged it off, saying the painters probably just used uneven strokes. Normally I would have accepted that, But by then, my trust in simple explanations was wearing thin. The shapes bothered me enough that I took a picture and showed it to a friend at school. He was Asian, and I asked if the markings looked like writing to him. He laughed at first, thinking I was trying to mess with him. When I insisted I was serious and explained everything that had been happening, his smile faded. He told me the shapes looked like symbols connected to death. I didn't want to believe him. I went home and searched for myself, comparing the photo over and over. The match was too close to ignore. I told my parents, but we didn't have the money to move, so I stayed in that room. Somehow I still managed to sleep, but I started waking up with scratches on my body. They weren't deep, but they were real. Thin lines that scabbed over. The worst one was on my wrist, dark and obvious enough that someone at school asked if I was hurting myself. I remember staring at that scratch in the mirror, feeling this heavy mix of fear and embarrassment. I knew I hadn't done it, but how do you explain that to anyone without sounding insane? Then came the night that broke whatever courage I had left. Around 3 a.m, I heard my cousin calling my name from the living room. His voice was clear, casual, like he was just asking me to come hang out. My cousin used to stay with us during summer break. The problem was, it wasn't summer. He wasn't in the house. I knew that. Still, the voice sounded so real that curiosity overpowered fear. I got out of bed and walked into the dark hallway. We had this old soldier statue in the living room, something antique and unsettling even in daylight. In the dark, it looked worse. As I stepped closer, I could swear its mouth was moving. A faint whisper slipped through the air. I couldn't understand the words, but I could hear the rhythm of speech. I moved closer without meaning to, like I was being pulled forward. The whispers got louder. My skin prickled from head to toe. I slammed the light switch. The statue wasn't in front of me anymore. It was across the room, turned toward the wall like it had never moved. The space where I'd just seen it was empty. My brain couldn't process what I was looking at. A wave of terror hit me so hard I felt dizzy. I ran back to my room screaming, loud enough to wake the whole house. I told my parents everything in broken sentences, shaking so badly I could barely stand still. Not long after that, we forced a move with whatever money we could scrape together. It wasn't easy, but none of us wanted to stay there anymore. Even now, years later, I still replay those nights in my head. The sounds, the shaking bed, the TV answering a thought I never spoke out loud, the scratches, the voice in the dark. I've tried to find normal explanations for all of it, and maybe some exist. But when I think about that room, about how it felt to stand in it alone at night, logic doesn't erase the memory of fear. There are other things that happen too, things I rarely talk about. That house left a mark on me. Even today, if I wake up in the middle of the night and hear a sudden noise, I'm right back there for a split second. A kid in a room that never felt empty, no matter how many lights were on. And that feeling is something I don't think I'll ever completely shake. When I was a kid, I went to a friend's birthday party at a bowling alley and somehow ended up winning a real bowling pin. It wasn't a miniature or a cheap plastic replica. It was a proper, full-sized pin, the kind that actually gets used in the lanes. I was thrilled, of course, and brought it home like it was a trophy. I put it on a high shelf above my bed, thinking it would be a permanent part of my room, something to show off to anyone who came in. For years, it just sat there, dusty and forgotten, a silent guardian in its perch. One night, many years later, I was lying in bed watching TV. The room was dark, except for the flickering light from the screen, the soft hum of the electronics filling the silence. I had dozed off, half awake, half dreaming, in that strange, in-between state where your mind isn't fully asleep but your body isn't really alert either. Suddenly I jolted awake. Something felt wrong. The room felt heavier, like the air had shifted, and there was this unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart started beating a little faster, that cold, prickling sensation running up my spine. Just then, I heard my dad yell my name from somewhere downstairs. Groggy, I let out a grunt and swung my legs out of bed, trying to figure out what he needed at this hour. As I stepped away from the bed, I heard it, a firm, almost reverberating whoomp, like someone had smacked a bed with their open palm. My stomach dropped, and I froze. Slowly, I turned around. The bowling pin was lying on my pillow, exactly where my head had been moments before. I stared at it, all trying to rationalize it. My first thought was that it had fallen, tipped over somehow, and I just hadn't noticed. My mind raced, the tiniest voice inside whispering, "That should have hit you. That should have killed you." I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just gravity or some fluke, and forced my legs to move toward the door. I went to see what my dad wanted, still glancing over my shoulder at the pillow. After helping him, I returned to my room. My brain was on edge, every instinct screaming that something about the pin was wrong. I went to put it back on the high shelf, wanting to restore the order that had been violently interrupted. That's when I noticed something strange. The shelf was covered in a thick layer of dust, except for a perfect circular spot where the pin had been resting. But more than that, the dust in front of the circle looked disturbed, displaced, as if the pin hadn't simply fallen. It had slid off. My stomach tightened. I stared at that pattern for a long time, trying to convince myself that there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe the shelf was tilted slightly, maybe the vibration of the TV or the house settling had caused it to move. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But something about it didn't feel right. The way it had landed, the way it had almost been on top of me, the precise imprint in the dust. It felt deliberate, like the pin had somehow chosen to move. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak of the house, every shifting shadow on the ceiling made my mind jump to the image of that bowling pin suddenly hurtling toward me. I kept imagining waking up to it on my pillow again, the memory of that whoomp echoing in my ears. The next day, I decided I wasn't taking any chances. I didn't want to put the pin back on that shelf, didn't want it anywhere near me again. I wrapped it up as best I could and went to a nearby lake, tossing it into the water. I watched it sink into the dark depths, waves rippling over it until it disappeared entirely. A strange relief washed over me as I walked away. It felt like I'd reclaimed some safety, as if that tiny act of disposal had removed the tension that had gripped my chest all night. Even after that, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that pin had been alive, in a sense I couldn't understand. For years afterward, I avoided thinking about it, avoided bowling alleys, and even avoided high shelves in my room. I never told anyone else in my family the full story, how close I had come to being hurt, or how strange the shelf and the dust had looked. But the memory lingered like a quiet warning in the back of my mind. I'm still not sure what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of light and subconscious fear. Maybe the pin really did just fall in an unlikely way, but even now, thinking back, I can feel that same chill sliding down my spine, and I can almost hear that soft, horrifying whoomp echoing in my memory. It's one of those things that leaves you questioning reality, that makes you wonder if objects can somehow move with intent, or if the mind, in those moments of half-sleep, can convince you that they do, whatever it was. I know one thing for certain. I am never keeping a bowling pin on a high shelf above my bed again. And if you ever find yourself staring at something heavy and unfamiliar on your pillow, consider my story a warning. Sometimes the things we think are harmless trophies aren't as innocent as they seem. I was about 12 years old and homesick that day. The kind of sick where your body feels heavy and your head is full of cotton. I had eaten a little bit and then stretched out on the living room couch, trying to rest. The living room sat directly under the staircase that led to the second floor of our apartment. The upstairs used to be an attic before my parents renovated it. After the renovation, it became a full living space with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a small room we called the library. The stairs were old though, and every sound from up there carried down perfectly. If someone walked across the floor, you heard it. If someone dropped something, you knew exactly where it fell. I was lying there staring out through the balcony doors, watching the daylight and trying to ignore how awful I felt. The apartment was quiet. My parents weren't home yet. I remember the air feeling still, almost thick. Then I heard it. A single step upstairs. It was sharp and clear. It sounded like a hard shoe hitting wood, the kind of dress shoes adults wear. It wasn't a creak or a settling noise. It was a deliberate step. My brain froze trying to process it. I stopped breathing for a second, listening. Every part of my body locked up. I told myself I must have imagined it. Fever does weird things. Houses make noises. There had to be an explanation. Then I heard it again. 2 more steps. They were spaced like a person walking slowly. Heel, pause, heel. The sound was so real, I could picture someone pacing above me. My stomach dropped. A wave of fear rushed through me so hard it almost made me dizzy. I didn't want to move because moving would make it real. If I stayed still, maybe it would stop. It didn't stop. The silence after those steps was worse than the noise. It felt like something was standing up there, listening back. I remember the hairs on my arms standing straight up. I was sweating but cold at the same time. My mind ran through every possibility. Someone broke in. A neighbor got in somehow. Something followed me home. None of the thoughts were logical, but fear doesn't care about logic, especially when you're a sick 12-year-old alone in a quiet apartment. Adrenaline finally snapped me out of it. I jumped off the couch so fast I almost tripped. The only thought in my head was that I needed something to protect myself. I ran into the kitchen because I remembered the knife I had used earlier to cut food. It was big, too big for me to be allowed to use normally. Or I had left it on the counter because I was too tired to wash dishes. I knew exactly where it should be. When I got to the kitchen, the counter was empty. Everything else was the same. The plate I used was there. The crumbs were there. The glass was there. But the knife was gone. I stood there staring at the spot where it should have been. My brain couldn't accept what I was seeing. I checked the sink. Nothing. I checked the other side of the counter. Nothing. The knife had vanished. That was the moment the fear turned into something deeper, heavier. It felt like the air got sucked out of the room. The idea that someone was upstairs mixed with the missing knife in my head, and I felt like I was going to pass out. I didn't want to go back into the living room. I didn't want to look at the stairs. I didn't want to be anywhere open. The bathroom felt like the only safe place because it had a lock and no stairs above it. I went in, shut the door, and locked it. I sat on the floor with my back against the tub, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I kept listening for footsteps, for movement, for anything. Every tiny noise sounded amplified, pipes clicking, the building settling, my own breathing echoing in my ears. Time stretched in a way that didn't feel normal. It might have been 10 minutes or an hour. I have no idea. I just sat there convinced that if I opened the door, something would be waiting on the other side. My fever made everything feel surreal, like I was half dreaming, but painfully aware at the same time. I kept replaying the steps in my head. The sound was too clean, too intentional to be random. I knew what I heard. Eventually I heard the front door open and my parents calling my name. I didn't answer right away because my brain was still stuck in panic mode. When I finally unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out, my legs were shaking so badly I had to hold the wall. They took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told them everything at once. The steps upstairs, the missing knife, the feeling that someone was in the apartment. They immediately went to check. My dad searched every room upstairs, every closet, every corner. Nothing was out of place. No open windows. No signs of anyone being there. My mom checked the kitchen and called me over. The knife was sitting on the counter, exactly where I had left it. I stared at it like it was a trick, and I walked over and touched it, just to make sure it was real. My parents exchanged that look adults do when they think they understand something you don't. They told me I was burning up with fever and probably hallucinated. High temperature, dehydration, sick kid alone with an overactive imagination. It made sense to them, but it didn't make sense to me. I know what it feels like to imagine something. This wasn't fuzzy or dreamlike. The footsteps were sharp and physical. The empty counter was clear as day. I can still remember the exact shape of the clean space where the knife should have been. My fear wasn't vague. It was specific and heavy and real. That night I refused to sleep upstairs. I stayed on the couch with the lights on, staring at the staircase. Every tiny creak made my heart jump. Nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no missing objects, just silence. But the silence didn't comfort me. It felt like whatever had been there had simply decided it was done. Even now, years later, I can replay the sound of those steps perfectly in my head. I've heard the apartment settle. I've heard pipes knock and floors creak. None of it sounds like that. Those were footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate. And the knife, I still can't explain that part at all. Maybe my parents were right, and the fever scrambled my senses. Maybe my brain filled in gaps and turned normal sounds into something terrifying. But there's a part of me that doesn't buy that explanation. The memory sits too solid in my mind. It doesn't feel like a dream. It feels like a moment where reality shifted just enough to let something else peek through. I don't like thinking about it for too long. When I do, I get the same tight feeling in my chest I had that day on the couch. The same awareness of how vulnerable it feels to be alone in a quiet home. I still avoid lying directly under staircases when I can. And every time I hear a step where no one should be walking, my body reacts before my brain does. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And no matter how many reasonable explanations I try to layer over it, that certainty has never faded. I used to have a tiny bedroom in my manufactured home that I turned into a computer room. Calling it a bedroom was generous. It was more like a narrow box with just enough space for a desk, a chair, and shelves stacked with old computer parts, wires, games, and random junk I couldn't bring myself to throw away. The doorway connected straight to the living room, so whenever I stepped out, I was immediately in the main part of the house. There was no hallway buffer, no transition space. Just one step and you were in the open. Inside that little room was a small closet built into the wall. It wasn't deep, just wide enough for a few shelves. I kept all my spare electronics in there. Old graphics cards, tangled cables, CD cases, manuals I'd never read but didn't want to lose. The closet door had one of those simple round knobs with a latch that clicked into place when you shut it. When it was closed, it stayed closed. You had to turn the knob to open it. It wasn't loose, it wasn't warped. It was a normal, boring closet door that had never once done anything strange. That's why what happened stuck with me so hard. It was late at night, the kind of late where the house feels hollow and every little sound carries. I had been sitting in the computer room with the lights off, just the glow of the monitor lighting up the walls. Eventually I stood up to go into the living room and turn on the main light. I remember feeling tired but calm. Nothing felt weird, nothing felt tense. It was just another quiet night. I stepped out of the computer room into the living room. The light switch was right there on the wall, maybe 5 feet from the closet door. You could stand in the living room and see straight into the computer room without moving your head. The closet door was shut, same as always. I didn't even look at it twice. Why would I? I raised my hand toward the switch. The second my fingers got close, the closet door exploded open. There's no better word for it. It didn't creak open. It didn't drift. It flew open with violent force, like someone on the inside had kicked it as hard as they could. The sound cracked through the air, a sharp bang that echoed in the tiny room. The door slammed against the wall so hard I thought it was going to break. The speed of it was unnatural. One moment it was latched shut, the next it was wide open and vibrating from the impact. I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My heart slammed into my throat. For a split second my brain refused to process what I had seen. I just stood there frozen, staring into the dark closet. My ears were ringing from the noise. The air felt charged, like after a lightning strike. I knew the latch had been engaged. I knew it. That door could not open without the knob turning, and I hadn't touched it. I was 5 feet away. My hand was still in the air near the light switch. The silence after the slam was worse than the sound itself. It felt thick, heavy. I kept expecting something to move inside the closet. A shadow, a shift, anything. But it was just open shelves and stacked junk sitting there like it always had. Completely normal, completely still. My body was buzzing with adrenaline. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I didn't want to walk closer. But I also couldn't stand just staring. I forced myself to step toward the computer room, slow and careful, like I was approaching a wild animal. The door hung open at a weird angle. One hinge looked slightly bent from the force of the impact. I reached out and touched the knob. My hand was shaking. I turned it slowly. It clicked like normal. I opened and closed the door a few times, testing it. Nothing unusual. It latched. It stayed shut. It behaved like an ordinary door. But when I unlatched it and let go, it drifted open on its own. Not fast, not violent. Just a slow, steady swing, like gravity had decided the door belonged open now. That had never happened before. Ever. The door had always stayed where you left it. Suddenly, it had a mind of its own. I stood there running through explanations. Pressure change, air movement, the house settling. But none of them made sense. There was no window open, no fan running. And even if there had been, air doesn't turn knobs. Air doesn't unlatch doors and launch them across a room like a cannon. The image kept replaying in my head. My hand reaching for the light. The instant explosion of motion. The timing felt personal. Like the door had reacted to me. That thought made my stomach twist. I turned on the living room light and checked the rest of the house. Every room, every corner. I half expected to find someone hiding, laughing, ready to explain it as a prank. But I was alone. The house was quiet and empty. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and my own breathing. When I came back to the computer room, the closet door was still open, waiting. I hated the way it looked. A simple open doorway shouldn't feel threatening, but it did. It felt like a mouth, like an invitation I didn't want to accept. I shut it and went back to the living room, leaving the lights on. I didn't go back into the computer room for the rest of the night. I sat on the couch pretending to watch TV while my mind circled the event over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that door flying open again. After that night, the door was never the same. The hinge was bent just enough that if I unlatched it, it would slowly swing open by itself every single time. It became a reminder, proof that something physical had happened. I could touch the damage. I could see the change. It wasn't just in my head. Nothing else dramatic ever followed. No voices, no shadows, no objects moving across the room. Just that one violent moment that rewrote how I felt in that space. The computer room never felt neutral again. I started noticing how small it was, how the air felt tighter in there. I caught myself glancing at the closet whenever I entered, checking the door like it might do it again. Sometimes late at night I'd sit at the desk and imagine it happening while my back was turned. The sudden slam, the shock, the feeling of something acting without permission. The thought alone was enough to make my shoulders tense. I tried to joke about it with friends, blamed cheap construction, said the house was warped. But deep down, I knew those explanations were just patches over a hole I didn't want to look into. Doors don't behave like that for no reason. Not once in years of living there had it ever even rattled. Then one night it decided to explode open at the exact second I reached for the light. What stuck with me most wasn't just fear. It was the sense of timing, the precision of it. If it had happened randomly while I was asleep, I might have shrugged it off. But it happened right in front of me, synchronized with my movement like a response. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel that jolt in my chest, that instant where the world feels unstable for a heartbeat, where something ordinary reveals a crack and you glimpse how fragile your sense of control really is. The door still worked. The closet still held the same junk. Life went on. But I never again looked at that room as just a room. It became a place where something impossible had happened once. And once is all it takes to change how you see a space forever. I still don't have an explanation that satisfies me. Maybe there is one buried in physics or pressure or cheap hinges. Maybe. But I know what I saw. I know how fast it moved. I know the sound it made and the way the impact shook the wall. And I know that for one split second, standing there with my hand in the air, it felt like the house itself had reached out and slapped the quiet wide open. When I was in 5th grade, my best friend was the kind of kid who carried a whole universe inside her head. She loved anything paranormal, ghosts, guardian spirits, strange sightings, weird dreams, and she told stories with such detail that even when I didn't believe her, I still wanted to hear every word. I was a skeptic even back then. I liked logic, explanations, things you could point at and prove. But listening to her was fun. The way she described things pulled you in. She didn't just say she saw something, she painted it in your mind. One of her favorite topics was her guardian angel. She talked about this figure like it was completely normal, like everyone had one, and she just happened to know hers personally. According to her, the angel was a very tall Indian woman, elegant, calm, protective. She said the woman stood straight and graceful, like a statue that could move. The detail that always stuck with me was the cheeks. My friend described them as being as red as 2 apples. She repeated that part a lot, almost proudly, like it was the signature feature. Eventually she started calling the figure Apple, and the nickname stuck. At the time I treated it like imaginative play. Kids invent things. Kids exaggerate. I assumed this was just her way of entertaining herself, maybe coping with fears or stress in a creative way. But she never told the story like a joke. She talked about Apple the same way you'd talk about a family member watching over you. Calm, certain, unshaken. Sometimes she'd mention seeing her in doorways, sometimes in corners of rooms. She said Apple never spoke, but she always felt safe when she was around. I didn't argue with her. I didn't encourage it either. I just listened. Eventually, the stories faded into the background of our friendship. We talked about school, games, crushes, all the normal things kids talk about. Apple became one of those odd details filed away in memory. Strange, but harmless. I stopped thinking about it altogether. Until the night she slept over at my house. Sleepovers were a big deal at that age. We'd planned it all week. Movies, snacks, staying up too late whispering about nonsense we thought was important. My room felt different with someone else in it, louder, warmer, alive in a way it usually wasn't. We fell asleep talking. I don't even remember what the last topic was. I just remember drifting off mid-sentence. At some point in the night, I woke up. I don't know what woke me. There was no noise. No crash, no sudden movement. It was the kind of waking where your eyes just open and you're instantly alert, like your body decided rest was over. The room was dim, lit only by a slice of streetlight sneaking through the curtains. Everything looked normal at first, the dresser, the posters, the soft shape of my friend sleeping beside me. Then I looked toward the end of the bed. There was a figure standing there. Even now, years later, I can see it clearly. It wasn't blurry. It wasn't a shadow that my brain filled in. It was defined, solid, tall enough that its head nearly brushed the ceiling. It stood perfectly still, facing us, facing me. The first thing I noticed was the height. The second was the face. The cheeks were red, not glowing, not exaggerated, just vividly, unmistakably red, like fresh apples. The exact description my friend had repeated so many times. The face was calm, expressionless. The eyes were open and unblinking, locked onto mine. There was no anger in that stare, no kindness either, just presence, awareness. And in that instant, I knew who it was. The realization didn't come with panic. That's the part that unsettles me the most when I think back on it. I should have screamed. I should have hidden under the blankets or shaken my friend awake. But instead, a strange calm washed over me. Not the calm of safety exactly, more like the calm of acceptance. Like my mind quietly said, yes, this exists, and that's all there is to it. I remember thinking very clearly, that's Apple. The thought felt obvious, final. There was no debate inside my head, no scrambling for logic, just recognition. The figure didn't move. It didn't step closer. It didn't reach out. It just stood there, watching. The air in the room felt heavy, like sound itself had been turned down. I could hear my own breathing, slow and steady. I could hear my friend breathing too, deep in sleep, completely unaware. For a few seconds, or maybe longer, time felt strange. We stared at each other, and then I turned over and went back to sleep. I didn't force myself to. I didn't decide to ignore it. My body simply rolled away from the edge of the bed, and my eyes closed like they were supposed to. The calm stayed with me as I drifted off, like a blanket pulled over my thoughts. When morning came, the room looked normal. Sunlight filled every corner. My friend was still asleep, tangled in the blankets. There was no sign of anything unusual. If it had been a dream, it was the most vivid one I'd ever had. But it didn't feel like a dream. Dreams have a texture to them, a softness around the edges. This memory was sharp. I watched her for a while after she woke up, waiting for some hint that she knew something had happened. She stretched, yawned, complained about her neck hurting from the pillow. Completely ordinary. At breakfast, we talked about cereal and cartoons and what we wanted to do that day. The words apple sat heavy in my throat, but I never said them. I don't know why I stayed quiet. Maybe I was afraid she'd confirm it. Maybe I was afraid she'd laugh and the experience would collapse into embarrassment. Or maybe some part of me understood that saying it out loud would make it more real than I was ready to handle. So I kept it to myself. The memory became mine, alone. And that was the last time she ever slept over. We didn't have a dramatic falling out. Life just shifted the way it does when you're young. Different classes, different friends, new routines. By middle school, we barely spoke. Eventually, we stopped talking altogether. Years passed. I never saw her again after graduation from that stage of childhood. But I never forgot that night. I've tried to explain it in every rational way possible. sleep paralysis, a waking dream, a trick of light mixed with suggestion from her stories. The brain is powerful, especially when you're a kid. It can build entire realities out of fear and imagination. I know that. I accept that explanation on paper. And yet, whenever I picture the end of that bed, I don't see a blur or a shadow. I see a woman standing straight and silent, cheeks red as apples, is watching over two sleeping children. I remember the weight of her gaze. I remember the calm that didn't belong to me, and no matter how many logical arguments I stack on top of the memory, it doesn't fade. It sits there, untouched. What unsettles me most isn't that I saw something, it's that I wasn't afraid. That calm felt borrowed, like it came from somewhere outside of me, like the figure standing there carried its own gravity and pulled my fear away. I sometimes wonder if that's what my friend felt all those times she said Apple was near. Not terror, but reassurance. A presence that didn't need to speak to be understood. I never told anyone this story for a long time. It sounded ridiculous even in my own head, but the memory never softened. It never turned fuzzy like childhood memories usually do. It stayed bright and exact. A single night preserved in perfect detail. I don't know where my friend is now. I don't know if she still believes in guardian angels, or if adulthood sanded down that part of her the way it does to so many people. Sometimes I wonder if she would remember Apple instantly if I brought it up. Sometimes I wonder if she'd look at me and say, casually, "Oh yeah, she used to visit you too." I think about that more often than I admit, because if she said yes, if she confirmed it without hesitation, I don't know what I'd do with that answer. All I know is that one night, in a quiet room lit by a thin slice of streetlight, I woke up and saw a figure that matched a story too perfectly to be coincidence. A figure that stood at the end of my bed and watched without blinking. A figure I recognized without being introduced. And instead of screaming, instead of running, instead of waking the house, I turned over and slept like I was being guarded. A few weeks ago, something happened that still sits in the back of my mind like a splinter I can't pull out. I've told the story a couple of times out loud, and every time I hear myself saying it, it sounds exaggerated, like something you'd read online and roll your eyes at. But I was there. My roommates were there. We all saw it unfold step by step, and none of us have been able to explain it in a way that feels satisfying. The apartment feels normal again now, but for a stretch of days it felt like we had invited something into our space that didn't belong there. It started on a completely ordinary afternoon. I had broken the headpiece of our bong while cleaning it in the sink. It slipped out of my wet hands, hit the porcelain, and shattered instantly. My roommates gave me hell about it for a few minutes, but it wasn't a huge deal. We decided to turn replacing it into an excuse to go out. We live in Philadelphia, and Old City isn't far, so we headed down there planning to browse smoke shops, maybe grab food, and kill a few hours. Old City always has this mix of polished tourist spots and little dusty stores that look like they've been frozen in time. We were walking past storefronts, half distracted, when we passed a thrift shop that looked completely out of place. The windows were crowded with old mannequins wearing dated clothes, faded signs, and stacks of objects that didn't seem organized in any real way. It had that dim, stale look, like sunlight didn't quite reach inside. One of my roommates joked that it looked haunted. We laughed, but instead of continuing on, we stepped inside. The air felt heavy in that way old buildings sometimes do, and thick with dust and the smell of aged fabric. The lighting was weak and yellow, making everything look slightly unreal. Racks of strange clothing were jammed close together, and shelves were packed with antiques that didn't match anything else in the room. Old board games, cracked mirrors, chipped statues, tangled jewelry, stacks of records. It felt less like a store and more like someone's forgotten attic. We wandered around for a while, poking through things, joking about ugly jackets and bizarre decorations. But after 10 minutes or so, the novelty wore off. None of us found anything worth buying, and the place had this quiet pressure to it that made me want fresh air. We started drifting toward the door. That's when my roommate spotted the Ouija board. It was sitting on a shelf between a stack of battered board games and a crooked ceramic figurine. The box was wrecked. The cardboard looked soft from age, corners crushed in, the print faded almost white. It looked like it had been handled 1,000 times and then abandoned. The second I recognized what it was, my stomach tightened. I told him to leave it alone. He grinned and picked it up. I wasn't laughing anymore. I've never liked those things. Whether someone believes in spirits or not doesn't even matter to me. Some objects just carry a bad feeling, and that box radiated it. I told him it was a dumb idea. He said that was exactly why he wanted it. The other roommate sided with him immediately. Within a couple minutes, they were at the counter buying it, while I stood there wishing I'd waited outside. The ride back to the apartment felt strangely tense. They joked about summoning demons and asking it stupid questions. I stayed quiet, staring out the window. I didn't want the box touching me, so it sat wedged between them in the back seat. I remember feeling relieved when we finally got home, like the outside air had been pressing in around the car. They opened it the second we walked through the door. The first thing I noticed was how wrong it looked compared to the box. The board inside was almost perfect. Smooth surface, clean lettering, no scratches. It looked brand new, like it had never been used once. The contrast was so sharp it made me uneasy. How does a box rot while the thing inside stays untouched? They shut off the lights in the living room, lit candles, and sat around it on the floor. I stayed on the couch, arms crossed, refusing to participate. They kept trying to pull me in, laughing, telling me I was overreacting. I told them I wanted nothing to do with it. Watching them slide the planchette around the board made my skin crawl. Whether they were moving it themselves or not didn't matter. The whole scene felt wrong. Later that night we had a big party already planned. The apartment filled with people, music, noise, drinks spilling everywhere. Word spread fast that there was a Ouija board, and it became the night's entertainment. Groups gathered around it like it was a novelty toy. Drunk people asking ridiculous questions, shrieking when it moved even a little. The candles got relit over and over. Everyone thought it was hilarious. Nothing dramatic happened that night. If anything, the chaos of the party drowned out whatever tension I'd been feeling. By morning, the apartment looked like a disaster zone, but the fear had faded into embarrassment. I felt stupid for getting worked up over a thrift store prop. The next day passed normally. Sunlight through the windows, hangovers, cleaning up cups and bottles. The board got hung on my roommate's wall like decoration. In the daylight, it looked harmless. We joked about it. I told myself that was the end of it. That night proved me wrong. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke to a knock on my bedroom door. One of my roommates stood there looking pale. He asked if I'd been playing music in the living room. I told him no, I'd been asleep. He said he kept hearing faint music drifting through the apartment, like an old song playing from far away. He thought someone had left the TV on, but when he checked the living room, it was completely dark. I told him he must have been dreaming and went back to sleep, but I didn't fall asleep easily after that. The next morning, our other roommate asked if I'd knocked on his door during the night. I hadn't. He swore he heard 3 solid knocks, clear as day. He woke up instantly and sat staring at the door. He said something deep in his gut told him not to open it. He couldn't explain why. He just knew opening that door felt like a mistake. We tried to laugh it off, but the laughter felt thin. The final night with that board is the part I replay the most. All of us were in the living room with a friend, just talking and drinking. We'd been sitting there for at least an hour. No one had left the room except to use the bathroom. Just before that, we'd been in my roommate's bedroom and saw the board hanging exactly where it always was. Our friend stood up to grab a beer. He opened the fridge and paused. Then he said, completely calm, "Why is the Ouija board in the fridge?" We laughed immediately. We thought he was messing with us. Then he reached in and pulled it out. The room went silent in a way I've never felt before. My ears rang. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step. I knew, with absolute certainty, that board had been on the wall. We had all seen it. No one had touched it. No one had left the room long enough to move it. And even if someone had, why the fridge? I started panicking. Real panic, not joking around. I told them we needed to get rid of it immediately. One roommate tried to argue that someone must have moved it as a prank, but nobody confessed. The longer we stood there staring at it, the worse the air felt. Thick, pressurized, like the room was holding its breath. We went to bed uneasy. Not even 5 minutes later, both roommates came into my room at the same time. They looked shaken. They said they were about to use the board again, but being near it made them feel sick. One of them said it felt like someone was standing right behind him when he looked at it. That was enough. We didn't debate anymore. We grabbed the board, left the apartment, and walked in silence. The city felt wrong, too quiet for that hour. Every shadow stretched too long. When we found a dumpster about 5 blocks away, we threw it in and stepped back like it might jump out. I half expected to see it hanging on the wall when we got home. It wasn't. Nothing else happened after that. The apartment settled back into its usual noise and mess. But sometimes, late at night, I remember that fridge door opening and the board sitting inside like it belonged there. And I still can't shake the feeling that we got rid of something that didn't want to be invited in the first place. I know how it sounds. If I heard this story from someone else, I'd assume they were exaggerating or misremembering. But I was there. I saw it. We all did. And that's what makes it stick with me. Not the fear in the moment, but the certainty that for a few days, reality in our apartment didn't behave the way it should. Near where I live, there's a small museum that has a reputation for being haunted. It's the kind of place where the staff will let you rent it out for a few hours in the evening, or even overnight if you want a really unique experience. The place is old, with creaky wooden floors, dusty glass cases, and dim lighting that makes every shadow feel alive. Years ago, it was even featured on an episode of Ghost Hunters, which only added to its eerie reputation. When I was planning my 16th birthday, I thought it would be fun to do something completely different, so I decided to rent the museum for an evening and invite a handful of my closest friends. That first night was surprisingly light-hearted. We spent most of it walking through the exhibits, joking around, and poking at the history of the old artifacts. At some point, we got the idea to try something a little spooky but fun. We would ask questions and see if the spirits could respond by turning on a light. It was harmless enough, just a little thrill, and we all laughed as we tried it. At first, the responses were slow, almost teasing, but then it started getting funny. One of my friends had been complaining and talking too much, so we asked the spirits if they wanted him to be quiet. Instantly, the light turned on, making all of us jump and then dissolve into laughter. It was playful and harmless, and the energy of the museum felt almost friendly. There was also something else that made the night memorable: a ghost cat. Obviously, we couldn't see it, but several of us felt something soft brush against us, and we heard a small, distinct meow more than once. It wasn't frightening at all. It was almost comforting, like the cat was watching over the group and keeping the place less intimidating. For the rest of the night, the ghost cat became a kind of mascot for us, an invisible companion that made the old museum feel less eerie and more like a place of adventure. That night we never felt scared. We were too caught up in the excitement, the jokes, and the thrill of asking spirits silly questions for the first time. A few weeks later, some of my friends wanted to take things further and try staying overnight. I agreed, curious but also a little nervous. When we arrived, the energy of the museum felt different somehow. We started the night as we had before, asking questions and waiting for responses. This time, nothing happened. For the first few minutes it was strange, but we laughed it off. Then, out of nowhere, I asked if the spirits wanted to be left alone, and the light flicked on within seconds. That was the first sign that the night was going to be very different from our first visit. We tried another room, one that had no previous strange activity for us. The moment I stepped in, a sudden wave of dread hit me. The air felt thick, heavy, almost suffocating, and I had this immediate instinctive feeling that I was not welcome. My stomach dropped, and my limbs felt heavy, but not in a normal way. It was like the room itself was resisting me being there. I didn't linger. I had to leave right away. I couldn't explain why, but it was easily the most afraid I've ever felt in my life. My friends noticed it too. There was a shared unease, a silent acknowledgement that something in that room was deeply wrong. We decided to retreat to the room where the ghost cat had been the first time, hoping the presence there would feel safer. It did, almost comforting, but that night wasn't over. I experienced sleep paralysis for the first time in my life while trying to sleep in that room. I woke unable to move, paralyzed, feeling like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't see anything clearly, but the sensation was enough to spike my fear. It felt like the friendly ghost cat couldn't protect me from whatever else lingered in the house. That night, every creak, every distant thump, and every shadow sent my heart racing. In the morning, I felt exhausted, but strangely exhilarated. Part of me wanted to go back, curious to see or hear the ghost cat again, to prove to myself that the museum could still feel playful and friendly like the first night. But another part of me couldn't shake the dread I had felt in that one room, the heavy, unwelcoming energy that had made me almost feel physically ill. There's a mannequin in that room now, one that looks normal during the day, but at night, under dim light, it feels wrong. Oddly enough, it hadn't felt scary during our first visit, but after that overnight stay, its presence adds another layer of discomfort that I can't ignore. Even weeks later, I'm still haunted by that one room. I can picture it clearly in my mind, the faint outlines of the exhibits, the cold air that seemed to cling to my skin, the faint, almost imperceptible feeling of being watched. I don't know if it was a spirit, a ghost cat, or some energy left behind from the museum's long history, but the memory of it stays with me. That room, once mundane, it now carries a weight I can't explain, a combination of fear and fascination that makes me hesitant to ever enter alone. The museum as a whole is fascinating, full of artifacts and stories from the past, but that one overnight visit changed how I see the place entirely. I still think about the ghost cat and how playful and gentle it seemed, but I also can't forget the unexplainable fear I felt in that other room, the paralysis, and the cold, heavy air that pressed in on me. It's a reminder that sometimes curiosity can lead you to experiences you aren't quite ready for, and that even in familiar, friendly-seeming spaces, the unknown can be terrifying. I would go back someday. Part of me wants to see the ghost cat again, to hear that soft meow or feel the invisible brush of fur. But I know I'll probably never enter that one room alone again. There's a sense of respect and caution now, a quiet acknowledgement that some parts of the world, seen and unseen, are best approached carefully, and that even a museum filled with history and playful spirits can hold corners that are not meant for the living. I was about 15, right in the middle of high school, at that age where afternoons blurred into late nights and most of my world existed inside my bedroom and on my computer screen. That day was completely ordinary. I was sitting at my desk playing Soldier of Fortune 2, completely absorbed in it, headphones on, lights off except for the glow of the monitor. The rest of the house was quiet in that comfortable way it gets when everyone's doing their own thing. My brother stopped by my room before leaving. I remember him standing in the doorway, saying he was heading out. It wasn't unusual. He came and went all the time, and I barely paused the game to acknowledge him. I just gave a distracted "okay" and went back to playing. I heard the front door close a minute later, and after that the house settled into silence again. About 10 minutes passed. I was deep in the game, focused, barely aware of anything else. Then I heard my name. It wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It was my brother's voice, clear as day, shouting from downstairs. He called my name the way he always did when he wanted something urgently, stretched out and impatient. Then I heard him yell again, telling me to get downstairs. I remember being annoyed more than anything. I ripped my headphones off, muttering to myself, thinking he must have come back because he forgot something. The voice was so real, so perfectly normal, that I didn't question it. I pushed my chair back and walked out of my room, already preparing to ask what he wanted. The stairs creaked the way they always did as I went down. The house felt normal. Nothing felt off. But when I reached the bottom step and looked into the living room, I stopped. It was empty. No lights on, no movement, no sound, just the quiet hum of the house. I called his name, expecting him to answer from the kitchen or the garage. Nothing. I checked every room downstairs. The front door was still locked. His shoes were gone. The driveway outside was empty. A cold, confused feeling started creeping up my spine. I stood in the living room, trying to replay what I'd heard. It hadn't been a vague noise or the TV or pipes in the walls. It was his voice. I could have sworn I could still hear the echo of it in my head. I grabbed my phone and called him. He answered casually, background noise humming behind him like he was already somewhere else. I asked him where he was. He told me he'd been gone for about 10 minutes. I asked if he'd come back to the house for any reason. He laughed and said no, why would he? I walked to the front window while we were talking and looked down the street. You could see everything from there. There were no cars pulling away, no doors slamming, no sign he'd been anywhere near the house. If he had come back, I would have seen him. There was no way he could have driven up, yelled and left without me noticing. I hung up and just stood there staring out the window. The house suddenly felt bigger and emptier than it had a few minutes earlier. The silence pressed in on me. I went back upstairs eventually, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't fear right away. It was disbelief. My brain kept trying to slot the event into something logical, but nothing fit. What bothered me most was how ordinary it sounded. There was no distortion, no whisper, no ghostly tone. It was my brother's normal voice, the exact pitch and cadence I'd heard 1,000 times. If someone had recorded it and played it back, I wouldn't have questioned it for a second. I didn't tell anyone that night. It felt stupid to bring up. Even in my own head, it sounded ridiculous. I convinced myself it was some weird auditory hallucination, maybe my brain mixing game audio with memory. Eventually, I pushed it to the back of my mind, but it didn't stay there. A while later, I was home alone again, this time at night. The house always sounded different after dark. Every creak was louder, every little noise felt closer. I was in my room trying to relax when I heard something downstairs. It sounded like marbles hitting tile, one at a time. Clink, pause, clink, pause, clink. Each impact was sharp and hollow, echoing faintly. The spacing between the sounds made it worse. It wasn't a crash or a spill. It was deliberate, like someone standing there, dropping them slowly. I sat up in bed and listened, holding my breath. The sound continued, steady and patient. A wave of dread rolled through me. I knew I was alone. I'd checked the doors earlier. My dog, who normally barked at everything, was completely silent. That silence scared me more than the noise. If someone was in the house, why wasn't he reacting? The clinking continued. I got out of bed and grabbed my gun from the safe. My hands were shaking, but not enough to stop me. I called my dog and he padded over, tail low, ears alert. We moved together toward the stairs. Every step down felt like stepping into colder air. The marble sound stopped right as I reached the bottom. The house was quiet again. I stood there listening, gun raised, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My dog crept ahead of me, sniffing. The living room looked normal at first glance. Furniture in place, lights off, nothing moving. Then I saw the back door. It was open, not wide open, but cracked enough to let a thin slice of night air spill inside. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. The curtain fluttered slightly from the breeze. My stomach dropped. I scanned the room, expecting someone to jump out. Instead, my eyes landed on something sitting in the middle of the floor. A rusted beer can. It looked ancient, like something dug out of a junkyard. The label was faded and peeling, the metal eaten away with reddish-brown corrosion. Oh, it didn't belong to anyone in the house. No one drank that brand. It looked like it had been sitting in dirt for decades. I stood there staring at it, trying to connect it to the marble sounds. The can was upright, perfectly still. There were no marbles anywhere, no broken glass, no sign of forced entry, just an open door and that can like it had been placed there carefully. I checked the rest of the house, every closet, every corner. Nothing, no footprints, no movement outside. The yard was empty. The night air felt heavy and still. I closed and locked the door, then picked up the can with a paper towel and threw it away. My hands felt numb while I did it. Sleep wasn't an option after that. I sat on the couch with the lights on until morning, my dog pressed against my leg. Every little sound made me flinch. I kept replaying the marble noise in my head, the slow rhythm of it. I never found a source for it. There was nothing upstairs that could have fallen. No loose objects, no explanation that made sense. The two incidents sat together in my memory like bookends, the voice and the marbles, both perfectly real in the moment, both impossible to prove afterward. I went back and forth for years, trying to decide what I believed. Maybe stress, maybe imagination, maybe someone messing with me in a way I never uncovered. But the emotional memory never changed. The certainty I felt when I heard my brother's voice, the raw fear walking down those stairs with the marble sounds echoing in the dark. Those feelings were real, regardless of the cause. I never had another experience quite like those after I moved out. That house faded into the background of my life, just another place I used to live. But sometimes, late at night when a sound carries strangely through a quiet room, I'm right back there. 15 years old, standing in a silent house, trying to understand how something so vivid could leave no trace behind. I still don't know if it was a haunting coincidence or just my brain playing tricks on me. What I do know is that in those moments, there was no doubt in my mind. The voice was real. The marbles were real. The fear was real. And sometimes that's the part that stays with you the longest, not the explanation, but the feeling that for a brief stretch of time, the world didn't behave the way it was supposed to, and you were the only one there to witness it. I am sorry for the interruption. I hate breaking the flow, but I am curious. Do you believe there is some truth to every story like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more, please subscribe. Okay, let's get back to it. This all happened back in 1976. I was living alone at the time, and one night I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. The room was completely dark, the kind of dark where every shadow seems alive. That's when I saw her, a young girl, just standing there in the room. She walked over to the bed, approached me, and reached out her hand. I felt her close around my wrist. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished. It was terrifying, but also completely surreal, like a glimpse into something that shouldn't exist. A few nights later, something else happened. I was again trying to drift off when I noticed a woman walking into my bedroom. She moved quietly along the foot of my bed. At first, I thought she had left, but when I tried to roll over, my elbow bumped into a body in the bed with me. There's a very particular feeling when you accidentally press against someone else's body, and that instant of realization sent a shock of fear through me. Then, just like before, the presence vanished. I was alone again, able to roll over and finally relax, though the tension lingered. After that, I didn't take any chances. I ended up finishing my lease with the living room light on all night so it would shine into the bedroom, just to keep the darkness from feeling so heavy. Eventually, I moved across town. In my new apartment, I would sometimes sleep on the living room sofa on weekends. I positioned myself so my back was to the open room, facing the back of the sofa, thinking it might help me feel safer. One night, I was sleeping soundly when I suddenly woke up completely alert. It wasn't the usual groggy awakening. I was fully awake, heart racing, with a strong instinct to look over my shoulder. When I did, I saw a figure in the darkness, hunched slightly, as if it had its hands on its knees, watching me sleep. The lower half of the figure was strange. It just faded out below the knees, as if it didn't have feet. My first instinct was to reach out. I swept my arm toward it, but the figure stepped back just enough to avoid my hand. I reached further, and it stepped back again, always staying just out of reach. I started getting frustrated. I jumped off the sofa and chased the figure across the living room, yelling, "I've got you now, you son of a bitch!" As I swept my arm through it, the figure faded out completely. It wasn't frightening in a typical way. It was almost like a visual effect, my arm passing through it as it disappeared into nothing. Still annoyed and unsettled, I turned on the lamp, checked the time, exactly 3 a.m., then turned it off and went back to sleep on the sofa. It wasn't until the next morning that the experience really hit me. Thinking back on it, the reality of what I had seen, the way it had interacted with me, and the impossibility of it all made me truly scared. I've had other experiences like this over the years, but this one stands out because it was so vivid, so detailed, and so impossible to explain. It left me with the lasting impression that there are forces, presences, or dimensions in our world that we just can't fully comprehend. And sometimes they step right into our reality without warning. I met him when we were both in junior high, and the friendship clicked so easily it almost felt arranged ahead of time. Some people you ease into slowly, but with him there was no awkward phase. Within days, we were acting like we'd known each other for years. Looking back, I think what bonded us most was how we both belonged to the night. While other kids talked about sports or video games, we talked about how peaceful everything felt after midnight. We were natural night owls stuck in teenage bodies with strict parents. Weekends quickly developed a rhythm. One of us would sleep over at the other's house. We'd pretend to settle down, then stay awake whispering and laughing until the sky started turning pale. Dawn always felt like a victory and a warning at the same time. That was the signal to scramble into sleeping positions before a parent checked in. We rarely pulled it off convincingly, but we kept trying. It became our ritual, our shared rebellion against normal schedules, and we guarded it like something sacred. The summer before high school, that ritual evolved into something bigger. It started accidentally. One humid night, I was at his place, and we were restless in that specific teenage way, convinced we were on the edge of adulthood and needed to prove it somehow. He suggested we go outside. There was no grand plan behind it, just the thrill of doing something we weren't supposed to do. We slipped out the back door into the yard, hearts pounding louder than our footsteps. Standing there under the open sky felt like crossing an invisible line. The moon was shockingly bright that night, the kind that washes everything in silver and makes shadows look deeper than they should. The neighborhood was silent, except for distant traffic and the hum of insects. We stood there grinning at each other, drunk on the idea that we were free. One step turned into 10. 10 turned into leaving the yard. And suddenly we were wandering the streets like explorers charting new territory. That first walk changed everything. After that, sneaking out became our summer tradition. Every night we met, we pushed a little farther. Side streets turned into main roads. We wandered into 24-hour convenience stores just to feel like we belonged there at that hour. We didn't buy much. We just drifted through the aisles, soaking in the fluorescent light and the weird feeling of being awake when most of the world wasn't. The city at night felt like a different dimension, quieter but charged with energy. When school started again, we refused to let the tradition die. Even on weekdays, we found ways to slip out for short walks. The night had claimed us. It felt like our private kingdom, empty and eerie and perfect. We loved the hush of it, the way our footsteps echoed, the way every small sound seemed magnified. There was comfort in knowing we were awake while others slept. It made us feel older, braver, like we were part of a secret club. The event that ended most of our exploring came in November. The air had turned sharp and cold, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed too fast. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but you could feel winter waiting just around the corner. On nights like that, we headed toward the library. The building kept its heat running overnight, and if you stood close enough, you could feel warmth leaking into the street. It became our cold weather checkpoint. We had to stay alert there because the police station sat only a short distance away. We'd been caught wandering late before and escorted home with lectures that stung worse than the cold. That night, we were moving quickly up the main street, shoulders hunched against the wind, talking quietly about nothing in particular. Then he appeared. One moment the street ahead of us was empty. The next, there was a figure standing about 2 blocks away. There was no gradual approach, no sound of footsteps, no sense of someone entering the scene. He was simply there. Both of us stopped mid-sentence. The figure had his back to us, slightly hunched, perfectly still. His streetlights painted him in uneven color. From that distance, the details were fuzzy but unsettling. It looked like he was wearing white pants, or maybe his legs were just unnaturally pale. Above that was what seemed like a long, brown coat hanging loose. His hair was the part that stuck with me. Long, black and stringy, hanging in messy strands that didn't move even in the wind. We'd passed strangers at night before. Usually there was a silent agreement to keep distance and move on. But this person felt wrong in a way that settled deep in my gut. The air around him seemed heavy. We kept walking but slowed instinctively, every step cautious. He swayed slightly, like a tree about to fall, but never quite committing. When we were closer, maybe a block and a half away, he spun around with shocking speed. The movement was too fast, too sharp, like a film skipping frames. Even at that distance, I felt the impact of his attention locking onto us. Then he started moving. Calling it a walk doesn't feel accurate. It was a distorted version of walking. One foot swung wide in an awkward arc before slapping down. The other stepped forward normally, his arms flung loosely at his sides, out of rhythm with his legs. The whole motion looked broken, like a puppet with tangled strings. Despite that, he covered ground frighteningly fast. We didn't discuss it. We didn't need to. Fear made the decision for us. We turned down the nearest side street at the same moment. Our brisk walk turned into a jog, then into full sprint. My breath burned in my chest. I could hear a strange cadence behind us, an uneven pattern of steps that didn't match human running. I refused to look back. Some part of me believed that seeing him closer would make him faster. We knew the neighborhood like a maze we'd memorized. Every alley, every loose gate, every shortcut. Halfway down a dark stretch with no streetlights, we dove into an alley that led to a backyard we'd slipped through dozens of times. We vaulted the gate, crouched behind a garage, and pressed ourselves into the shadows. We stayed there frozen, listening. The night swallowed sound. My ears rang with the echo of our own running. I waited for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that confirmed he'd followed us. Nothing came. The silence felt thicker than before, like it was hiding something. We didn't speak. Even whispering felt dangerous. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 15 minutes, we risked moving again. We crept through back routes, sticking to the darkest edges, flinching at every distant noise. The walk back to his house felt endless. When we finally slipped inside and locked the door, the click of the bolt sounded louder than it should have. We checked windows, pulled curtains tight, and retreated to his room without another word. We didn't sleep that night. We sat with the lights on, backs against the wall, pretending to joke about what we'd seen. But every laugh came out strained. The image of that walk replayed in my head over and over. That wide, swinging step, the unnatural speed, the way he'd appeared from nowhere. We never stopped going out entirely, but the boldness was gone after that. The streets didn't feel like our domain anymore. They felt occupied. Sometimes we'd bring it up months later, circling the memory like it might reveal a rational explanation if we stared at it long enough. He swore he saw the face when the figure turned. Said it looked feminine, with hollow eyes and a long nose. I don't remember the face. Maybe my mind refused to keep it. What stayed with me wasn't a clear image. It was the feeling, that deep animal certainty that if we hadn't run, something terrible would have happened. Even now, years later, when I walk alone at night and see someone standing too still under a streetlight, my chest tightens. For a split second, I'm 16 again, frozen on a cold November street, watching a shape twist itself into motion and come straight toward me. I was around 13 or 14 when this happened, the age where every afternoon felt endless and the only real responsibility in life was figuring out what to do before the sun went down. I spent most of that summer at my friend's house. His place was the unofficial hangout spot because his backyard was huge compared to everyone else's, and his parents didn't mind us running wild as long as we stayed outside and didn't break anything important. One weekend his nephew was visiting, who was about our age, and my friend pulled out his prized possession, a full laser tag set. Not the cheap kind with tiny plastic pistols, but a full kit with guns and chest armor that lit up and made loud electronic beeping sounds when you got hit. To us, it felt like military-grade equipment. We treated it like it was the coolest technology we'd ever seen. His backyard was perfect for it. There was a big, open, grassy area, a few trees scattered around, and a storage building off to the side that we used as a base. The building was old, with faded paint and dusty windows that reflected the sunlight in a weird, hazy way. It had just enough corners and blind spots to make the game intense. We'd sprint around it, duck behind it, and ambush each other like we were in some action movie. That day was bright and clear. I remember the sky being a deep blue with no clouds at all. The air had that hot, dry summer smell, and the grass scratched at our legs when we slid across it. We'd been playing for a while already, sweaty and out of breath, but too competitive to stop. The laser tag sets were working perfectly, or chirping and flashing every time someone landed a hit. At one point, I was crouched near the side of the storage building, trying to sneak around and surprise my friend. His nephew was somewhere behind me, and I could hear their footsteps in the grass. Everything felt normal, loud in the way only kids playing outside can be. Then, without warning, the entire world lit up. There's no other way to describe it. A bright, white flash exploded across the sky. It wasn't like sunlight or lightning. It was sharper, cleaner, like a camera flash multiplied 1,000 times. For a split second, everything around us turned white. The window of the storage building caught the light and reflected it straight back, and it felt like we were standing inside a giant light bulb. At the exact same moment, all 3 laser tag armors went crazy. They started beeping and flashing in a pattern we had never seen before. Not the normal "you got hit" sound. This was louder, faster, almost frantic. All of them activated at the same time, perfectly synchronized, like they were reacting to the flash instead of to each other. The lights on our chests blinked wildly, and the guns made a high-pitched electronic whine that sent a chill straight through me. We froze. None of us fired. None of us moved. We just stood there staring at each other, the beeping filling the backyard. The sudden silence after the flash made the noise feel 10 times louder. I could see the same fear on their faces that I felt in my stomach. It wasn't the playful kind of scared, like when someone jumps out to surprise you. This was a heavy, confused fear. The kind where your brain can't immediately find an explanation, so it jumps to the worst possibilities. The beeping lasted a few seconds, maybe longer. It felt stretched out, like time slowed down. When the armor finally went quiet, the backyard seemed unnaturally still. Even the normal summer sounds felt distant. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just 3 kids standing there in plastic armor, staring up at a perfectly blue sky that looked completely innocent. The first thing we all did was look up. There was nothing there, no clouds, no plane, no smoke trail, no thunder rolling in after the fact. Just a bright, empty sky, like nothing had happened. If it weren't for the laser tag sets still blinking weakly as they reset, I could have convinced myself I imagined it. My friend was the first to speak. He asked if we saw that. It was a stupid question, but it broke the silence. We all started talking at once, trying to describe the flash, asking if it was lightning, even though we all knew it couldn't have been. There were no storm clouds anywhere. The air didn't smell like rain. There was no thunder, and lightning doesn't normally set off electronics like that in perfect unison. We checked the equipment, thinking maybe the batteries had glitched, but everything looked normal. No melted parts, no smoke, no loose wires. When we tested the guns again, they worked like nothing had happened. The armor beeped in its usual way, calm and predictable. That somehow made it worse. If the sets had broken, we could have blamed cheap electronics. But they were fine. The only strange thing was that moment we couldn't explain. We stood around for a few minutes, all pretending to laugh it off, but none of us wanted to keep playing. The fun had drained out of the afternoon. Every time I glanced at the sky, I felt a tight knot in my chest, like I was waiting for it to happen again. We eventually packed up the laser tag gear without saying much. The storage building, which had been our fortress all day, suddenly felt creepy. The window that reflected the flash looked darker now, like it was hiding something. It's funny how quickly a place can change in your mind. 10 minutes earlier, it was just a backyard. Now it felt like the center of something we didn't understand. We went inside and tried to distract ourselves with video games, but the conversation kept circling back to the flash. Each of us described it the same way. A white burst, instant and blinding, like a massive camera flash right above us. We all agreed it wasn't lightning. The sky had been too clear, and none of us remembered hearing any sound connected to it. No crack, no boom, just light. As the evening went on, we started building theories the way kids do. Maybe it was a satellite reflecting sunlight. Maybe a military test. Maybe some kind of power surge in the neighborhood. Every explanation sounded thin, like we were trying to patch a hole with paper. The memory of that synchronized beeping stuck with me the most. The way all three sets reacted at the exact same time felt deliberate, almost targeted. When I went home that night, I kept replaying it in my head. The brightness, the silence after, the feeling that something had briefly reached down and touched our little game in the backyard. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding ridiculous. It felt like one of those moments that only make sense to the people who were there. Years passed, but the memory never faded the way most childhood memories do. Usually things blur together. Faces soften, details disappear. But that flash stayed sharp. I can still see the reflection in the dusty window. I can still hear the frantic beeping. Whenever I run into that friend now, the story always comes up eventually. We'll be talking about old times, and someone will mention the laser tag incident. Every time, we end up sitting there quietly for a second, remembering how it felt. What sticks with both of us isn't just the mystery, it's the shared certainty. We know it happened. We all saw the same thing. We all felt that same wave of fear. There's comfort in that, in a strange way. It wasn't a dream or a misunderstanding. It was a real moment that cut into an ordinary day and left a mark. Even now, as an adult, I still don't have an explanation that fully satisfies me. Maybe there is a scientific answer buried somewhere in atmospheric physics or electrical anomalies. Maybe it was some rare reflection of light we happened to stand under at the perfect angle. But no matter how I try to reason it out, the emotional memory doesn't change. It still feels like the sky blinked just once, and for a second we saw something we weren't meant to notice. We never played laser tag in that backyard again. Not because we made a rule about it, but because none of us suggested it. The equipment stayed in a closet, and eventually we outgrew it. But every time I think about that summer, that moment stands apart from everything else. A bright, white interruption in an otherwise normal memory. And the strangest part is how ordinary the world looked right after. The grass was still green. The air was still hot. The sky went back to being harmless blue. Life continued like nothing had happened. Only we carried it with us. This tiny, unexplained event that refused to fade. To this day, if I see a sudden flash of light out of the corner of my eye, my heart jumps in the same way it did back then. For a split second, I'm back in that backyard, standing in plastic armor, staring at my friends while our gear screams in confusion. And I'm reminded that sometimes the scariest moments aren't the loud ones or the violent ones. Sometimes it's just a brief crack in the normal world, a flash that doesn't belong, and the quiet certainty that you'll never fully understand what you saw. I was about 12 years old, small enough that the back seat of the car still felt huge, like my own little moving room. It was late, around 1 in the morning, the kind of hour when the world feels paused and quiet in a way that almost doesn't feel real. My dad was driving, focused on the road, and my sister was in the front seat, half asleep, leaning against the window. We had been out longer than usual, and the tired silence inside the car wrapped around us like a blanket. Outside, the streets were nearly empty. The traffic lights cycled through their colors for no one, and the occasional street lamp lit patches of road like small islands of yellow light in a sea of darkness. I remember staring out the window without really thinking, just watching the night slide by. At that age, I loved late-night car rides. Everything looked different after midnight. Familiar places turned strange. Houses seemed to hide secrets. Even the lake we passed all the time looked deeper and darker, like it was swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. When we rolled to a stop at a red light near the lake, the car engine hummed softly, and for a moment it felt like we were the only people awake in the entire city. That was when my eyes drifted toward the field beside the lake. At first, I thought my tired brain was playing tricks on me because I saw a glow where there shouldn't have been one. Then the glow sharpened into flames. A fire was burning out there, big enough to light up the grass around it. The flames moved wildly, bright orange and white, twisting into the air. It didn't look like a small campfire. It looked intense, alive, like it had a purpose. My heart jumped into my throat, not because I thought the fire would spread, but because of what stood in front of it. There was a woman. She was standing completely still, facing the fire. The light from the flames outlined her shape in sharp contrast against the darkness. She wore something long and pale that hung straight down, like a nightgown or a thin dress. Her hair looked loose and dark, falling around her shoulders. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, watching the fire as if nothing else existed. The sight hit me with a strange mix of fear and confusion. It didn't make sense. Who would be standing in a field at 1 a.m, staring into a huge fire? And why did she look so calm? The whole scene felt disconnected from reality, unlike I was watching a silent movie that had been layered over the real world. Without thinking, I blurted out, "What's that woman doing?" My voice sounded too loud inside the car. My dad and sister both turned their heads at the same time. "What woman?" my sister asked, her voice thick with sleep. "That woman," I said, pointing hard at the window, my finger shaking. "Right there, next to the fire." They leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. My dad's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "I see the fire," he said slowly, "but there's nobody there." I felt a rush of panic. "Yes, there is," I insisted. "She's right there. She's standing right there." They looked again, longer this time, scanning the field carefully. My sister shook her head. "There's no one," she said. "It's just the fire." A cold feeling spread through my chest. I knew what I was seeing. The woman was still there, unchanged, still facing the flames. I could see the outline of her arms, the way her dress moved slightly in the heat rising from the fire. She was so clear to me that it felt impossible anyone else could miss her. I suddenly became terrified of blinking. Some instinct told me that if I looked away, even for a second, she would vanish. So I locked my eyes on her and refused to move. "No," I said, my voice rising. "Look again. She's right there. How can you not see her?" My dad glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his face tight. The light turned green, and the car began to roll forward. As we moved, the angle shifted, and the field started to slide out of view. I twisted in my seat, straining to keep her in sight. For one last moment, I saw her silhouette against the fire, perfectly still, like a figure cut out of shadow and pasted onto the world. Then, the trees and darkness swallowed the scene. She was gone. I slumped back into my seat, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The car felt different now, smaller and colder. My dad asked me a few gentle questions, trying to understand what I thought I'd seen. I struggled to explain it. The words sounded weak compared to the image burned into my mind. A woman, a fire, standing there, watching. That was all I could say. They both promised they weren't joking with me. They swore they had only seen the fire, no person, no shape, nothing that even looked human. Their certainty scared me more than the sight itself. If they had been teasing me, I could have brushed it off as a trick. But they were serious. They looked unsettled, not amused. The rest of the drive home passed in uneasy silence. I kept replaying the image over and over, the way she stood, the way the fire framed her, the complete stillness of her body. It didn't feel like a normal memory. It felt carved into me, sharp and permanent. That night I lay awake in bed much longer than I should have. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the field again. I imagined what would have happened if we had stopped the car and walked toward her. Would she have turned around? Would she have had a face? Or would she have stayed frozen, forever watching the flames? The questions looped endlessly, and none of them had answers. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the light and shadows created an illusion. Maybe there was a person there, but the angle from the front seat made her invisible. Maybe my tired brain filled in details that weren't real. I repeated these ideas like a mantra, but they never settled comfortably. They felt forced, like excuses pasted over something I didn't want to examine too closely. What haunted me most wasn't just seeing her. It was the certainty I felt in that moment. I wasn't guessing. I wasn't imagining shapes in the dark. I knew I was looking at a person. The clarity of that knowledge stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can picture the exact posture of her body and the height of the flames beside her. Sometimes I wonder if the fear came from being singled out in a strange way. I was the only one who saw her. Out of the three of us in that car, whatever that moment was, belonged only to me. That created a lonely kind of terror, the feeling of being separated from everyone else by an invisible line. They shared the same space, the same night, the same road, but not the same reality. We passed that lake many times after that. In daylight it looked harmless, almost boring. The field was just grass and dirt. There were no scorch marks, no signs of a fire that big ever having burned there. Every time we stopped at that light again, I found myself staring out the window, half hoping and half dreading that I would see her again. I never did, but the memory never softened. It didn't fade the way childhood memories usually do. It stayed sharp, like it was preserved in glass. I can still feel the texture of the car seat under my hands, still hear the hum of the engine, still see the reflection of the fire flickering in the window. And I can still see her standing in front of those flames, silent and unmoving, as if she had stepped out of another world for a few seconds and let me notice. I don't claim to know what I saw. I don't even try to label it anymore. I just carry it as one of those moments that refuses to fit neatly into explanation. A small tear in the ordinary fabric of a quiet night, witnessed by a tired 12-year-old who happened to look in the right direction at the wrong time. What stays with me most is the feeling I had as we drove away. Not just fear, but a strange sadness, like I had left something unfinished behind. As if the woman and the fire were part of a story I wasn't meant to hear the ending of. And maybe that's why it still lingers. Some moments don't end cleanly, they just stop. And you're left holding the echo of them for the rest of your life. I was visiting my ex in Oxford, and he worked in one of the oldest university buildings there. I was a bit bummed that I had to explore the town alone while he was at work, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to wander and soak in the atmosphere of the historic streets. On one particular day, I decided to meet him a bit earlier because I desperately needed to use the restroom. He let me in and showed me a narrow, twisty staircase, saying the ladies' room was down there before hurrying back to his kitchen duties. I headed down the staircase, excited to be exploring the inside of such an ancient building. When I finally found the ladies' room, I did the quickest, most efficient pee of my life. But the moment I stepped into that small bathroom, something felt off. It was beautiful, in a Victorian sort of way, but there was this oppressive energy that I couldn't shake. It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. The temperature was freezing, even colder than I expected for the middle of the day, and it gave me the shivers. I couldn't explain it, but something about that room screamed at me to leave immediately. I didn't linger. I hurried back up the stairs, feeling a mix of relief and unease, and decided to wait around the back of the building for my ex to finish his shift. Later that evening, curious about the building's history and perhaps trying to rationalize my own reaction, I casually asked him if he ever found it spooky working there in the evenings. He shrugged and said, "Not really," though I noticed he was giving me a look like he already had an idea of why I was asking. I told him that the bathroom had felt eerie and oppressive. That's when he went pale and told me a story about a co-worker. Apparently, one night his colleague had gone down to the ladies' room for a quick bathroom break. While inside, he saw a woman standing with her back to him. Startled, he panicked and quickly left the room, thinking he had walked into the wrong restroom. But after checking, he realized he had indeed entered the correct ladies' room. Curious and trying to make sense of what he saw, he peeked back in to let her know the mix-up. But the room was empty. There had been no one there. What terrified him even more was that the clothing the woman appeared to be wearing was centuries old, like it belonged to a different era entirely. It wasn't just old-fashioned, it was from a time long before the building's modern usage, maybe hundreds of years back. He tried to tell himself it must have been a trick of the light, a shadow, or exhaustion after a long shift. But the memory still haunted him. Thinking back to my own experience, I understood exactly what he meant. The cold air, the heavy atmosphere, and the almost instinctual panic I felt weren't my imagination. That bathroom, for all its Victorian charm, had a presence I couldn't shake off. Even now, when I picture that little space, I can feel the weight of it, the chill, and that undeniable sense that something unseen was there, watching, lingering, and entirely out of place in the modern world. It's strange how some spaces, no matter how historical or beautiful, can carry echoes of the past that touch you without warning. I've been in old buildings before, and some had charm, some had character, but that bathroom in Oxford was different. It wasn't just the age of the wood, the cold tile, or the narrow staircase. It was the sense that time itself had left a shadow behind, one that I, for a brief moment, was unlucky enough to step into. Even after leaving the building, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It wasn't like a typical scare or jump. There was no sudden movement, no sound, just a weight pressing in from nowhere. And knowing that someone else had actually seen something tangible, centuries out of place, made the memory even more real. It was as if the building itself had a story to tell, one that didn't involve words, only sensations and fleeting glimpses of what had come before. The weirdest part was how normal everything else felt. Outside, the streets of Oxford were alive with students and tourists, the historic buildings glimmering in the evening light. Inside that small bathroom, though, time didn't behave normally. I felt small, isolated, and unnervingly aware of every corner, every shadow. It's hard to explain unless you felt it, the uncanny feeling that something exists in a place where it has no right to be. I've thought about going back, curious to see if the feeling was unique to that moment, or if the space always held that weight. But part of me fears what I might see. The thought of stepping into that bathroom again, knowing what my ex's co-worker saw and what I experienced, is enough to make my stomach twist. Some things in old buildings are better left alone, I think, quietly preserved behind closed doors and narrow staircases, glimpsed only by accident, never sought out deliberately. Even now, years later, I remember the oppressive chill, the heavy feeling in the air, and that uncanny instinct to leave immediately. It's a memory that sticks with you, not a story of terror in the traditional sense, but of something subtle and undeniable, a presence that doesn't belong to the modern world but refuses to disappear. That little bathroom in Oxford isn't just old, it's haunted by the echoes of the past, and I was one of the few to feel it. I remember this night vividly, even though it happened when I was still really young. I was terrified of Freddy Krueger, the character from the movies and shows my older sister loved. She knew exactly how to get under my skin, teasing me relentlessly about him, telling me stories about his clawed glove and the way he came for you in your dreams. Being the little sister, I didn't have much choice but to listen, and it made the fear grow every time I tried to sleep. Every time the lights went out, I would imagine him lurking in the shadows, standing in the doorway, or just waiting in the darkness for me to fall asleep. That particular night, I had woken up to use the bathroom while the rest of the house was silent. The hallway was dark, not even a sliver of light from the street outside, and everything was quiet, except for the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. When I returned to my bed, that feeling of unease didn't leave. In fact, it grew stronger. My heart was beating faster, and I had this sudden, intense dread that made the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck stand up. I remember curling under my blankets, trying to tell myself it was nothing, that Freddy wasn't real, and that my sister's teasing was just that, teasing. But somehow, I knew in that moment that something felt very wrong. Then I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I slowly rolled over toward the doorway, there he was. Freddy Krueger. It was pitch black in the room, but his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't just a shadow. I could see him, almost glowing in the darkness. Or he had the shape of the Freddy I had seen on TV. Tall, thin, clawed glove, and that terrifying grin that sent shivers down my spine. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, tapping his gloved fingers on it slowly. His presence wasn't quiet either. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, like the air itself was holding its breath. I froze, unable to move, unable to even scream. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to run, but my body felt like it had turned to stone. I wanted to tell myself this was a dream, but it didn't feel like any dream I had ever had before. This was real. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if every breath required more effort than the last. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my chest rising and falling rapidly, but the terror wasn't just in my body. It was everywhere around me. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping when I opened them, he would be gone. Maybe if I just willed it, everything would go back to normal, and I could crawl under my blankets and forget this ever happened. But when I opened my eyes, he had moved. He was no longer just in the doorway. He was in the room. And somehow, impossibly, he was closer. I couldn't understand how he had moved so silently, so effortlessly, without a sound. It was like the darkness itself had carried him across the room. I screamed. The sound tore out of me before I could stop it. My mom came running, flipping on the lights in a rush, and of course he was gone. Just like that, the room returned to normal. The shadows in the corners, the empty hallway, the quiet hum of the house. My mom tried to tell me it was just a dream, but I knew better. I knew that whatever I had seen, whatever had been there, had been real in the way that things that aren't supposed to exist feel real. You can't argue with that kind of fear when it settles in your chest and refuses to let go. Even after that night, the feeling didn't go away completely. My sister's teasing continued, but I started noticing other things about the house. The closet in my parents' bedroom always felt wrong. There was no logical reason for it. I'd never seen anything unusual there. Nothing moved, nothing obvious. But whenever I was in that room, a sense of unease settled over me like a thick blanket. It wasn't fear in the moment, not like with Freddie, but more like anticipation, like I was waiting for something I didn't want to see. My sister admitted she felt the same thing, though she never said much about it. Even my brother-in-law mentioned it once, saying he'd had the same creepy feeling when he was in the room. What really made it worse was the way the feeling would linger after I left the room. Even in other parts of the house, I'd feel like I was being watched, like some presence had followed me, waiting. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that it was my imagination, that the mind of a scared child could turn anything into a threat. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just imagination. The fear was too precise, too controlled, like something was intentionally manipulating the environment, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. That night with Freddy Krueger became a reference point for every other odd or unexplainable thing that happened in the house. Even the smallest creaks or flickers of shadow would send a wave of panic through me, and I would remember how real that presence had felt. The way he had glowed, the slow tapping of his claws on the door, the way he seemed to move through the room without a sound. Those images stuck in my mind in a way that movies or books never could. It wasn't just fear, it was a lesson in vigilance, in noticing the small details that others might dismiss. Over time, I developed a sense of awareness in that house that bordered on hypervigilance. I could hear sounds others wouldn't notice, feel changes in the air that others ignored, and sense when a room wasn't quite right. The closet in my parents' bedroom remained a constant source of unease. I never dared to open it at night, and during the day I would only glance at it from the doorway. I began to understand that sometimes fear isn't about what is in front of you, it's about what might be. As I grew older, I tried to forget about the night with Freddy Krueger, to chalk it up to a vivid childhood imagination. But even now, years later, when I close my eyes in that house, I can feel the lingering tension. The sense of being watched, of something waiting, has never fully left me. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but it's always there. A reminder that some experiences leave marks you can't erase, no matter how much you try. Looking back, I realized that night shaped how I perceive fear. I learned that terror isn't just about monsters or ghosts. It's about the uncertainty, the things you can't explain, the moments where reality seems to bend and leave you exposed. Freddy Krueger wasn't just a character from a movie for me. He was a symbol of all the unseen dangers that make your mind race and your body freeze. The encounter taught me that some fears are unavoidable, some presences are undeniable, and some nights stay with you forever. Even today, when I visit my parents' house, I can feel that room, the darkness, the way shadows gather in the corners, the faint sound of movement that isn't really there. It's not constant, but it's enough to remind me of the nights I spent trying to convince myself that I was safe, that the glowing figure at my door wasn't real. It's a feeling I carry with me, a lesson in vigilance and the persistence of fear, the way some things are never truly gone, no matter how much time passes or how old you get. That one night shaped my understanding of the supernatural and the way we respond to fear. It wasn't just a dream or a story, at least it didn't feel like one. It was real enough to change me, real enough to teach me that some parts of childhood terror don't fade with age. They stay with you quietly, lurking in the corners, teaching you to be aware, teaching you to respect the things you can't explain. And that's a lesson that has stayed with me ever since. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I stayed at my grandparents' house for several days to help them prepare for our big Thanksgiving family gathering. Their house sits in a quiet neighborhood that always felt peaceful when I was growing up. But after my great-grandmother passed away there, the place never felt the same. She had outlived my great-grandfather by years, and when her health started to fail, she made it clear she wanted to die at home. She didn't want a hospital room or strangers around her. She wanted the house she loved, the same walls that had watched her raise a family and grow old. So when the time came, we all gathered there and said our goodbyes. The house has carried a strange energy ever since. My grandparents talk about it openly now, though at first they were afraid to. They swear they still hear coffee being made at exactly 5 in the morning. Every day of her adult life, my great-grandmother woke up at that hour and brewed a pot. Even now, years later, they say they can hear the soft clink of the glass pot, the faint gurgle of water, the small sounds of someone moving carefully in the kitchen. They also hear footsteps at night, slow and steady, like someone walking through the hallway while they lie in bed. My grandmother once sat me down and cried while telling me she wanted to move out because she was so scared. I had never seen that kind of fear in her before. She kept saying the house didn't feel empty. My grandfather refused to leave. He insisted it was just an old house making old sounds. Over time, my grandmother seemed calmer, but I never forgot how shaken she was that day. My girlfriend, on the other hand, hates anything, even slightly paranormal. Ghost stories, horror movies, strange noises in the dark. All of it gets under her skin. Before we even went to stay there, she reminded me of the stories I had told her about my grandparents' house. She said that if she needed to use the bathroom at night, she wanted me awake while she went. I laughed it off at the time, thinking she was being dramatic, but I agreed. The first night we went to bed late after a long day of cleaning and moving furniture. I fell asleep almost instantly. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up, but it wasn't gentle. I was dragged out of sleep by her shouting right in my ear. She was screaming my name and telling me to stop, saying it wasn't funny and that we were leaving. I shot upright, completely confused, my heart racing. It took me several seconds just to understand where I was. She was pressed against the edge of the bed, shaking. I kept asking what happened, and she kept insisting I had grabbed her. I swore I hadn't moved. Slowly, through tears, she explained that she felt 2 fingers walk up her back. That was how she described it. Walk. Not slide, not brush. Walk. She said it felt like individual fingertips stepping up her spine, stopping at the collar of her shirt, then hooking into the fabric and pulling it down hard. There was no way to joke about something like that. I could see she was terrified in a way that went beyond imagination. It took a long time to calm her down and convince her I had been asleep the entire time. She kept checking my hands like she expected to find proof. I barely managed to convince her to stay the rest of the night. Even then, she refused to turn her back to the room. I had to lie behind her with my arms wrapped around her, almost like I was shielding her from whatever she thought was there. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every tiny sound in the house. The air felt heavy. Every creak made my chest tighten. Eventually, she drifted into an uneasy sleep under the covers, but I didn't rest much at all. The next day, we acted normal. We helped my grandparents, ran errands, and tried not to talk about what happened. My girlfriend stuck close to me the entire time. That night, we went out late to grab Chinese food because we were too tired to cook. When we came back, the house was completely silent. My grandparents had gone to bed hours earlier. The lights were off except for a small lamp in the living room, and my girlfriend went straight to the kitchen to plate the food. I sat down in the computer chair in the living room, about to turn the PC on. The silence was deep, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Then, out of nowhere, I heard whistling. It wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. It sounded like someone was standing maybe 10 feet in front of me, right by the big wooden hutch against the wall. It was a clear, steady tune, like someone who had practiced it 1,000 times. My head snapped toward the sound. I expected to see a person. My brain insisted there had to be a person there, but the space in front of the hutch was empty. The whistling didn't stop. It continued, calm and confident, filling the room. I couldn't blink. I felt frozen in place, trapped between fear and disbelief. Every instinct told me that whatever was making that sound should have realized it had been noticed and gone quiet. Instead, it kept going, note after note, as if it didn't care that I was staring straight at it. The sound was painfully human. That's the only way I can describe it. It wasn't distorted or ghostly. It had breath in it, rhythm, intention. I remember searching the air for a face, a shape, anything that could explain what I was hearing. My skin prickled like I was standing in a cold wind. The whistling lasted around 10 seconds, but it felt much longer. When it finally stopped, the silence crashed back down so suddenly it made my ears ring. I jumped out of the chair and ran to the kitchen. My voice came out shaky as I asked my girlfriend if she had been whistling. She laughed at first, confused by the question. Then she looked at my face, and her expression changed instantly. She knew something was wrong. When I told her what I heard, she didn't even argue. She just said we were leaving. We packed up our things in a rush and walked out into the cold night air. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute in that house. We drove around for a while before deciding to come back in the morning. There was no chance she would have slept there after that. The next day, while helping prepare Thanksgiving dinner, we told my grandparents everything. I expected them to be worried or at least surprised. Instead, they looked at each other and laughed softly. My grandfather said it was my great-grandfather. Apparently, he used to whistle constantly, whether he was working, walking, or just sitting around the house. It was one of his habits, something everyone associated with him. My grandparents spoke about it so casually that it almost made the story feel normal, like we were talking about an old family joke instead of something impossible. Then my grandmother reminded me of something I had completely forgotten. When I was a kid, I used to play with a neighbor girl who stayed with her grandparents for the summer. One evening I came home after playing outside, and my grandmother asked if I had stopped by the house earlier. I told her I hadn't. She looked confused and said she heard me walking around inside, whistling, and had been searching for me to see where I was eating dinner. At the time, I brushed it off and didn't think about it again. Kids don't question things the way adults do. Hearing that memory brought back in the context of my own experience made my stomach drop. Since that visit, the house has never felt the same to me. Every time I step inside, I'm aware of that exact spot in the living room. I catch myself glancing at the hutch, half expecting to hear the tune again. The air always feels thick with memory. It's not that I feel watched in a threatening way. It's more like the house refuses to let go of the people who loved it. The whistling seems connected to me being there, and I don't know why. Maybe it's coincidence. Maybe it's something else. What scares me most isn't the sound itself. It's the certainty it planted in me. I've had other strange moments in my life. Shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Voices that turned out to be nothing. But this was different. This was close, direct, undeniable. There was no explanation that fit neatly into logic. The memory sits in my chest like a stone. Whenever I visit my grandparents, I listen more than I talk. I pay attention to the quiet spaces between sounds. Part of me hopes I never hear it again. Another part of me almost wants to, just to prove to myself that it really happened. I still don't know what song it was. I wish I had been brave enough to focus on the melody instead of the fear. All I remember is the feeling of being pinned in place, staring at empty air while something invisible filled the room with a human breath. That memory follows me out of the house every time I leave. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and hear it as clearly as if I were sitting in that chair again, waiting for the silence to break. The story ends here. If this one stayed with you, please leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe so you are here for the next one. Until then, stay safe.